My name is Claire Bennett, and I remember the exact second my life split into a before and an after. I was standing at my desk on the 14th floor of Halden Marketing, holding a cup of coffee that was still too hot to drink, when the elevator doors opened and my husband walked out holding a manila folder. He did not smile. He did not wave. He walked straight toward me with the kind of calm that only comes from a person who has already made peace with hurting you. And right behind him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, walked my boss, Vanessa Kane, wearing a deep red blazer and an expression I will never forget for as long as I live. She was smiling, not a polite smile, not an accidental one, a smile that said she had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Daniel set the folder on my desk in front of my entire team. He did not lower his voice. He said the words loud enough for the whole floor to hear, that he wanted a divorce and that he had already filed the papers that morning. My hands were shaking so hard that my coffee spilled across the folder, blurring the ink on the first page, the page that had my name printed next to the word respondent. I looked up at him, waiting for some kind of explanation, some kind of decency, and instead I looked past his shoulder and saw Vanessa standing there, arms crossed, watching me like she was watching a show she had personally written. I did not cry in that moment. I want to be clear about that, because for months afterward people asked me how I held it together, and the truth is that I did not hold anything together. I simply went numb. My brain refused to process what was happening fast enough for my body to react. I just stood there, coffee dripping onto the carpet, 30 coworkers pretending to look at their screens while stealing glances at the wreckage of my marriage happening in real time. Daniel left without saying another word. Vanessa did not leave right away. She walked past me, close enough that I could smell her perfume, and she said, in a voice just quiet enough that only I could hear it, that some people were simply not meant to keep what they had. Then she turned and walked into her corner office and shut the door. I want to take you back for a moment, because none of this happened out of nowhere. Daniel and I met 8 years earlier at a small design conference in Austin. He was charming in a way that felt effortless. The kind of man who remembered small details about your life and brought them up weeks later just to show he was listening. We married after 2 years. We built a life that looked, from the outside, like something people admired. A home in a quiet neighborhood outside Denver. 2 dogs. Weekend trips to the mountains. I thought I understood the architecture of my own marriage. 14 months before the day in the office, I got a promotion at Halden Marketing, moving from account coordinator to senior strategist under Vanessa Kane, a woman who had built a reputation as brilliant, demanding, and impossible to please. I admired her at first. I studied the way she spoke in meetings, the way she never raised her voice, but somehow controlled every room she entered. I did not know, could not have known, that while I was learning from her professionally, she was quietly inserting herself into my personal life in a way I never saw coming. It started small. Daniel mentioned meeting my boss at a company holiday party. Then he mentioned running into her again at a coffee shop near his office, which made no sense because her office was nowhere near his. Then there were late nights he explained away as client emergencies, and a new cologne I did not recognize, and a phone he started angling away from me at dinner. I noticed all of it. I chose, for a long time, to believe the simplest explanation instead of the true one, because the true one was too painful to hold. Looking back now, I understand that Vanessa did not simply fall into an affair with my husband. She built it, piece by piece, the same way she built a marketing campaign, with intention and patience, and a clear final objective. And the objective was never just Daniel. The objective was replacing me, not just in my marriage, but in my career, in my sense of self, in every room I had ever occupied. She wanted me gone, and she wanted to be the one standing there when it happened. The day after the divorce papers landed on my desk, I walked into the office fully expecting to be quietly managed out. Instead, Vanessa called me into her office and told me, with a straight face, that she hoped this would not affect my professionalism, and that Halden Marketing valued composure under pressure. I sat there and listened to my husband's mistress lecture me about composure, and something inside me shifted from grief into focus. I did not sleep well that first week. Some nights I lay awake replaying every conversation, every trip, every excuse, trying to find the moment I should have seen it coming. My best friend Nora Ellison stayed with me for the first 4 nights because she did not trust me to be alone with my own thoughts. She would sit at the edge of my bed while I stared at the ceiling, and she kept repeating the same sentence, that Daniel and Vanessa had shown me exactly who they were in front of an entire office, and that I owed it to myself to believe them completely, instead of quietly forgiving a version of them that only existed in my imagination. I remember calling my mother that same week, sitting on the bathroom floor with my back against the tub, trying to explain what had happened without falling apart on the phone. She listened quietly, and then she said something I did not expect. She told me that humiliation only works on people who agree to shrink afterward, and that I did not have to agree to anything. I did not fully understand what she meant in that moment, but I wrote it down anyway, on a sticky note, and pressed it to the edge of my bathroom mirror where I would see it every morning. But somewhere around night 4, my mind stopped asking why this happened to me, and started asking a different question entirely. What exactly had they built together, and what would happen if it all came apart in public, the same way my marriage just had? I began paying attention in a different way. Not out of suspicion this time, but out of purpose. I noticed that Vanessa had been quietly steering a major account, the Whitmore retail contract, worth almost $4 million annually, away from proper agency channels and into a side arrangement with a vendor owned by her cousin, a man named Gregory Aldis. I noticed that Daniel, who worked in finance at a firm called Bristow Capital, had recently been added as a signing authority on an account tied to that same vendor relationship. 2 people who had spent over a year hiding an affair from me had also, apparently, spent that same year building something financial together, something that did not belong to either of them. I did not act right away. I am not someone who moves on anger alone. Anger without a plan simply burns the person holding it. Instead, I spent 6 weeks quietly gathering everything I could. I requested copies of vendor invoices under the excuse of a quarterly audit, which was well within my role. I cross-referenced payment dates with calendar entries. I saved emails. I documented timestamps. I built, methodically and carefully, exactly the kind of file that a woman like Vanessa would have respected if she had seen it as a stranger's work instead of her own downfall. During those 6 weeks, I also had to survive the divorce proceedings. Daniel's lawyer, a sharp, tired-looking man named Franklin Doyle, tried to paint me as emotionally unstable during mediation, citing my quote-unquote erratic behavior at the office, which was, of course, the day he humiliated me in front of 30 colleagues. My own lawyer, a steady and unflappable woman named Renata Ose, told me something during our second meeting that I have carried with me ever since. She said that people who blow up someone else's life in public usually assume that person will grieve quietly in private. She told me that the ones who fight back calmly are the ones nobody sees coming. I also had to keep functioning at work, sitting through meetings led by the same woman who had spent over a year lying to my face, listening to her talk about trust and collaboration as though those words meant something to her. There were mornings I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before I could make myself walk inside, rehearsing a calm expression in the rearview mirror before facing another day beside her. A coworker named Priya Sharma, who sat 2 desks away from mine, quietly started covering for me during the worst mornings, rescheduling my early calls without being asked, and never once mentioning the reason why. Small kindnesses like that were the only thing that kept those weeks from completely breaking me. The financial documents were harder to gather than I expected. Vendor invoices for the Whitmore retail account were split across 3 different internal systems, and Vanessa had structured approvals so that no single document told the full story on its own. It took patience to build the picture one piece at a time, matching a purchase order here with an email approval there, cross-referencing dates against her travel calendar and against Daniel's calendar, which I still had partial access to through a shared family cloud account neither of us had bothered to disconnect. I did not enjoy the process. There was nothing satisfying about confirming, in cold financial language, exactly how long the 2 of them had been building a life around deceiving me. But I kept going, because stopping would have meant letting the humiliation in that office become the final word on who I was. The moment I chose to act was not random. Halden Marketing was preparing for its annual investor and client showcase, an event where senior leadership presented account performance to major stakeholders, including 2 board members flying in from New York. Vanessa was scheduled to present the Whitmore retail account as the crown achievement of the year. The account she had personally cultivated and expanded, according to her own words, through smart vendor partnerships and closer supplier relationships. I requested 5 minutes on the agenda under the label of a supporting financial summary, a request that was approved without much scrutiny since junior strategists were often given small supporting slots. Vanessa did not even look up when she approved it. She had no reason to suspect that the quiet woman she had humiliated in front of the entire office was about to speak in front of the people who controlled her career. The night before the showcase, I sat in my kitchen with Renata on speakerphone, going over every document one final time. She asked me if I was certain I wanted to do this in front of everyone, rather than simply filing a report through internal compliance. I told her that Vanessa did not choose privacy when she destroyed my marriage in front of 30 witnesses, and I was not going to offer her the privacy she never offered me. The next morning, I walked into the auditorium wearing the navy suit I had bought for my wedding rehearsal dinner years earlier, the only formal thing I owned that still felt like armor instead of memory. Vanessa presented first. She stood at the podium with total confidence, walking the board through rising revenue numbers, glowing client satisfaction scores, and what she called a uniquely efficient vendor pipeline. Daniel was there too, seated near the back with a few Bristow Capital colleagues, since Bristow handled some of the company's investment reporting. I do not think either of them noticed me watching from the side of the room, waiting. When my 5 minutes came, I walked to the podium, connected my laptop, and pulled up a clean financial breakdown of the Whitmore retail account. I did not raise my voice. I did not mention affairs or marriages or divorce papers. I spoke only in numbers, only in facts, exactly the way Vanessa had trained me to present. I showed the board that the vendor behind the account's supposed deficiency was owned by Vanessa's cousin. I showed that pricing on that vendor's contracts was nearly 30% above market rate, quietly padding profits that flowed back through a shell arrangement. I showed the timeline connecting Daniel's signing authority at Bristow Capital to payment approvals tied to that same vendor, raising a direct conflict of interest question for both companies. The room went silent in a way that felt heavier than any shouting could have. One of the board members, a composed older man named Harlan Whitcomb, asked Vanessa directly whether the information was accurate. She tried to explain it away as a standard supplier relationship, but her voice cracked in a way that told everyone in that room the truth before she ever finished her sentence. Daniel stood up near the back, clearly trying to leave quietly, but one of the Bristow Capital partners stopped him at the door and asked him to sit back down, because apparently this concerned his firm as well. I did not gloat. I did not smile the way Vanessa had smiled at me weeks earlier. I simply thanked the board for their time, closed my laptop, and returned to my seat. Vanessa was placed on administrative leave by the end of that same day, pending a full compliance investigation. Within 3 weeks, she resigned entirely rather than face formal termination, and Halden Marketing quietly severed all ties with the vendor tied to her cousin. Daniel's firm launched its own internal review, and I later learned through mutual acquaintances that he was let go within 2 months, his name quietly attached to a conflict of interest report that followed him to every interview afterward. My divorce finalized not long after that, and financially, it looked nothing like what Daniel and his lawyer had originally tried to negotiate. Once the affair and the financial entanglement became part of the public record through the investigation, my position in the settlement shifted entirely in my favor. Renata later told me it was one of the cleanest reversals she had ever seen in over a decade of practicing family law. 6 months after the showcase, I was promoted into Vanessa's former role, not because I fought for the position, but because the board specifically requested that I take it, citing what Harlan Whitcomb called integrity under pressure. I still remember walking into that office for the first time as its new occupant, running my hand along the same desk where Vanessa used to stand and smile at me like she had already won. People sometimes ask me if I regret staying quiet for those 6 weeks instead of confronting them the moment I found out. I tell them the truth. If I had screamed in that hallway, if I had thrown that folder back at Daniel or slapped the smile off Vanessa's face, it would have made me feel something for exactly 1 minute. Instead, I built something slow and precise, and it took both of their careers, their credibility, and quite a bit of their comfort with them. I think about that day often. The coffee spilling across divorce papers, The sound of 30 coworkers pretending not to listen. The small curl at the corner of Vanessa's mouth as she watched my life fall apart in public. I think about it, and then I think about the silence in that boardroom months later, the moment her voice cracked in front of people whose approval she had spent years chasing. I think about Daniel being asked to sit back down by his own partner, unable to walk away from the very kind of consequence he handed to me without a second thought. Nora came over the night after the showcase with a bottle of wine we never actually opened, and we sat on my kitchen floor because somehow it felt more honest than sitting at the table. She asked me how it felt to finally watch them lose, and I told her the truth, that it did not feel like winning exactly, it felt like finally being allowed to breathe. She laughed and told me that was probably the most honest description of revenge she had ever heard, and that most people who imagine getting even never stop to think about what comes after. The quiet, ordinary relief of simply not being lied to anymore. My mother called a few days later after hearing the full story from me over the phone, and she reminded me of the sticky note still pressed to my bathroom mirror. She asked if I remembered what she had told me that first week, about humiliation only working on people who agree to shrink afterward. I told her I remembered every word and that I had spent 6 weeks refusing to shrink, one document at a time. People sometimes ask me if I regret staying quiet for those 6 weeks instead of confronting them the moment I found out. I tell them the truth. If I had screamed in that hallway, if I had thrown that folder back at Daniel or slapped the smile off Vanessa's face, it would have made me feel something for exactly 1 minute. Instead, I built something slow and precise, and it took both of their careers, their credibility, and quite a bit of their comfort with them. I think about that day often. The coffee spilling across divorce papers, the sound of 30 coworkers pretending not to listen, the small curl at the corner of Vanessa's mouth as she watched my life fall apart in public. I think about it, and then I think about the silence in that boardroom months later, the moment her voice cracked in front of people whose approval she had spent years chasing. I think about Daniel being asked to sit back down by his own partner, unable to walk away from the very kind of consequence he handed to me without a second thought. If there is one thing I have learned from all of this, it is that public humiliation is a weapon that only works as long as the other person stays silent. The moment I stopped being silent and started being precise instead, the entire balance of power in that story shifted, and it never shifted back. And if you are sitting somewhere right now, holding your own version of that folder, your own version of that smile aimed at you from across a room, I want you to remember one thing before you decide what happens next. Quiet does not mean weak. Sometimes quiet is simply the sound of someone building something you will not see coming until it is already finished.